The younger brother of a notorious Peruvian serial killer, a man known as the Apostle of Death, was arrested in Japan on suspicion of killing 6 people. Police in Saitama faced criticism for allowing him to escape during questioning just before he allegedly carried out his series of murders.
Hello, and welcome back to Dark Crimes Real.
In 2015, Japan's birth rate was falling sharply. The elderly population had surpassed 26%, and the younger workforce had been shrinking for more than a decade. As the country aged, many manufacturing sectors struggled with severe labor shortages, leaving factories in suburban prefectures like Gunma, Saitama, Shizuoka, and Aichi without enough workers to keep their production lines running. To cope with this, Japan turned to a unique group of workers, foreign nationals of Japanese descent, known as Nikkei. They were the descendants of Japanese migrants who had moved to Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina in the last century, and later returned to Japan under the revised immigration law of 1990. This law allowed second- and third-generation Nikkei to obtain long-term residence visas and work with relative freedom without being tied to a single sponsoring company like many other foreign workers. Thanks to this policy, the number of South American workers in Japan jumped from about 200,000 in 1995 to more than 300,000 in the early 2000s, and later stabilized around 200,000 to 250,000 by 2015, with Brazilians and Peruvians making up the largest share. The Peruvian community alone had around 50,000 residents in Japan at that time. Most lived in industrial areas where the work was stable but heavy, repetitive, and required little language skill. In theory, the policy gave them a stable foundation to live and work. But in reality, many immigrants ended up in food factories, parts assembly plants, and processing facilities in the suburbs, workplaces known for heavy labor, relentless pace, and limited opportunities for advancement. They often lived in low-cost apartment blocks, worked long shifts, and had almost no interaction with local communities because of language barriers. Social reports from that period noted that many foreign workers, even after years in Japan, still couldn't speak more than basic Japanese. Isolation slowly became part of their everyday routine. They ate alone, worked alone, and rarely connected with their Japanese neighbors or co-workers. When income was unstable, work was monotonous, and factory pressure repeated year after year, the mental health of some workers began to deteriorate. Several studies also warned about rising rates of depression, anxiety, and unusual behavior among immigrant groups who had lived in prolonged isolation. Around the same time, Japan also recorded a handful of cases where immigrants became involved in unlawful behavior, not many in number, but enough to raise public concerns about cultural integration and the level of support available to them. These isolated incidents mostly involved breaking into people's homes, losing control due to psychological distress or workplace conflicts, showing that a portion of immigrant workers were quietly struggling under the pressure of life in Japan's suburbs. At around 12:30 p.m. on September 13, 2015, a household in the city of Kumagaya called the police after discovering a strange man had entered their yard. He spoke fragmented Japanese, could not clearly explain why he was there, and appeared tense when asked about his residence. When the police asked, "How can we help you?" the man reportedly responded, "Police, police," as if he were making a phone call, then tapped his wallet and said, "Money, money." When officers approached, the man showed no signs of wanting to attack, but his eyes kept darting around, as if he were guarding himself against something unseen. He repeatedly said he wanted to return to Peru and spoke in Spanish, so police decided they needed an interpreter and brought him to the Kumagaya police station. At the station, his responses became even more disorganized. He said he wanted to leave Japan and that he would visit his sister in Kanagawa.
Officers instructed him to call his family, but the relatives spoke unclear Japanese, and the man began crying throughout the call. The officers described him as someone running from an invisible threat. The interview was interrupted several times because he could not remain calm. Around 3 p.m., he went to the restroom, then cried again and ignored all questions. He later asked for a smoking break and was escorted to the smoking area outside the entrance. Near 3:30 p.m., when asked to return to the station, he pushed the officers aside, ran through a red light across the road in front of the station, and fled into a family restaurant. One officer chased him but lost sight of him. He left behind a bag containing about 3,400 yen in cash, around $22, along with his passport and cell phone inside the station. When police reviewed his phone call history, they found he had contacted several foreign acquaintances before being questioned. During the interview, he complained about strange behavior happening around him and said he was about to be killed. Although the Kumagaya police station did not suspect a crime at this point, they believed he might cause some kind of trouble because he could not communicate in Japanese and had suspiciously fled the station, leaving all his belongings behind. They began searching with 7 officers, then added around 20 more. They asked his relatives to contact them if he appeared, and sent officers to check the home where he might go. On the afternoon of September 14, a woman visited the home of a married couple who lived not far from the station. She was the wife's walking partner. They had their usual evening walk planned, but that day, when she knocked, no one answered. When the door was opened, a chaotic scene appeared inside. The couple had been found dead in their home, their bodies showing signs of knife attacks. Drawers had been pulled open, and on the wall of their room, strange characters resembling an alphabet were written in blood. Police investigated the possibility that the killer had written them. At the scene, officers also found unfamiliar footprints and some food items opened in the kitchen, suggesting the perpetrator had stayed inside the home for a short time. A car believed to belong to the couple was seen driving the wrong way on a road, and was later found abandoned in a parking lot about 200 meters from their home. A bicycle had also been stolen from the parking area, but was found on September 15 in Ishihara, Kumagaya City. It was possible the suspect stole the couple's car after killing them, then hid in the nearby area, stole another bicycle, and fled farther away. At that time, police could not confirm whether this case was related to the man who had escaped the station the previous day. Everything was still only suspicion. On September 15, an 84-year-old woman who lived alone was found killed in her home in Ishihara, about 400 meters north of Ishihara Station and roughly 1 kilometer northwest of the first crime scene. There were no major signs of struggle, but the food in the kitchen had been disturbed, several items had been moved, and the lights and air conditioning were still on, indicating the perpetrator had stayed in the home to rest or eat, another similarity with the previous scene. On the afternoon of September 16, police received a call from a woman who had come to visit her daughter-in-law and 2 granddaughters, but received no answer. This home was less than 100 meters from the second scene. When police approached the front door, it was initially unlocked, but only a few seconds later, when an officer tried again, the door had been locked from the inside. The suspect might have broken in and was now barricading himself. A group of officers walked around to the back to check for access to the second floor. As they reached the eaves, a figure suddenly appeared in the window. It was a short-haired man, exhausted and tense, holding a kitchen knife. He leaned out, eyes wide open in panic. Realizing he had been discovered, he immediately used the knife to harm himself on both arms, then raised 2 fingers to his chest as if making a sign of prayer. Seconds later, he dove through the window and fell to the ground. The fall knocked him unconscious instantly. He was taken into custody, 2 kitchen knives were confiscated, and he was transported to a hospital in Fukaya City. When police searched the house, a mother and her two elementary school-aged daughters had been killed. The mother's body was found inside a closet on the first floor. On the second floor, the two girls were found in a wardrobe, their bodies covered with blankets. Items in the house had been disturbed, some food had been opened, and evidence suggested the perpetrator had remained inside for hours before being discovered. Over just 3 days, 3 homes located close to one another in a quiet residential neighborhood had become scenes of consecutive killings. From the 3 locations, police began matching fingerprints, blood samples, and witness information. Several residents had seen a foreign man walking erratically through the area in recent days, often appearing in the late afternoon and looking as though he were on the run. The descriptions matched the man who had jumped from the window. When police compared the evidence to the records from the station, they identified him as Byron Jonathan Nakada, the man who had left all his personal belongings behind when he escaped, leaving him with no option but to wander the area seeking temporary shelter. When investigators assembled the physical evidence from all 3 scenes, fingerprints, shoe prints, and forensic results, the identity of the perpetrator became clear. Forensic experts confirmed that the murder weapons in all 3 homes were kitchen knives taken from each victim's residence. His rummaging through the houses and eating the victim's food seemed like minor details, but they were consistent patterns that linked the crimes together. And the fact that he chose 3 neighboring homes showed he had no means of transportation and had likely moved by foot between each location.
Byron Jonathan Nakada, a Peruvian national, was around 30 years old at the time of the case. Immigration records show that he had come to Japan in 2005 and lived mainly in the Kanto region, working in various factories. Before coming to Japan, Byron grew up in a family in Peru. Economic instability and a turbulent home environment pushed him to leave his country as soon as he had the chance. Years earlier, he had witnessed traumatic events involving his older brother, Pedro Nakada, a man the Peruvian press called the Apostle of Death. Pedro confessed to killing around 25 people and was sentenced to a total of 35 years in prison for at least 17 murders. Most of his victims were shot with a 9mm pistol fitted with a homemade suppressor. He was arrested in late 2006 after running out of ammunition during a confrontation with police at his workplace. Pedro, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and had previously attempted to end his own life, was held in a psychiatric prison in eastern Lima since 2007. This was a shadow Byron rarely spoke about, but people who knew him believed it had a significant emotional impact on him from a young age. Immigration documents in Japan also revealed that the surname Nakada was not Byron's real family name. In Peru, he went through a fraudulent adoption procedure with someone of Japanese descent so he could change his surname to Nakada, allowing him to qualify for a residency status meant for Nikkei, descendants of Japanese immigrants returning to Japan. With this status, Byron received a long-term residence visa, giving him broad freedom to work. However, his Japanese language ability was extremely limited and barely improved over nearly 10 years in the country. Throughout this time, Byron worked in several factories. His last job was at a food processing plant in Gunma Prefecture. Co-workers described him as quiet, barely social, and someone who always ate alone. He rarely participated in any activities with those around him, and this gradually led to deep isolation. When problems arose at work, he lacked the language skills to explain them, and when he faced personal difficulties, he had no support network to rely on. Signs of instability became more noticeable in the weeks leading up to the incident. At work, Byron told his supervisor he could no longer return to the factory and insisted that a man in a suit was following him. He left the workplace and disappeared for several days. When he later reached Kumagaya and was taken to the police station on suspicion of trespassing, his panic became even more apparent.
His fragmented speech, his crying during conversations with family members, and his decision to flee while leaving behind all his belongings indicated that he was experiencing a severe psychological crisis. Byron was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, marked by paranoid delusions and impaired cognition. But at the time of the murders, the people around him were unaware of this condition, and Byron himself had never received professional treatment. Living in prolonged isolation, under heavy factory pressure, and without any medical or social support, losing control seemed almost inevitable. Byron remained unconscious for a period of time, but he woke up on September 24th and was discharged from the hospital on October 8th. That same day, he was arrested as a suspect in the first case involving the murdered couple. On November 4th, he was arrested as a suspect in the second case involving the 84-year-old woman. And on November 25th, he was arrested as a suspect in the third case in which a mother and her two daughters were killed in their own home. He denied all charges. The legal proceedings against Byron stretched on for years because multiple psychiatric evaluations and legal arguments were required. His mental state at the time of the crimes became the central focus of the entire trial. During questioning, he often claimed he couldn't remember anything. At times, he admitted to killing 6 people, only to immediately deny it and ask, "When did I ever say that?" When the victims' families asked him to apologize, Byron responded, "Why should I apologize? Japan should apologize to me." In the 2018 initial trial, prosecutors presented evidence showing that Byron's level of awareness was sufficient for criminal responsibility. His actions, hiding the bodies in all 3 homes, eating food inside the houses, wiping away blood and fleeing the scenes, were interpreted as deliberate behavior. The lower court ruled that he had the capacity to understand his actions and sentenced him to death. However, the appeals process unfolded differently. Psychiatric experts testified that Byron had symptoms of schizophrenia, with delusions that had developed over many years, and that his mental condition had been severely impaired at the time of the killings. The High Court accepted this conclusion, determining that the degree of diminished mental capacity was sufficient enough to reconsider the sentence. The death sentence was overturned and replaced with life imprisonment. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the life sentence was upheld and officially finalized. Beyond the courtroom, the reactions of the victims' families and the local community showed that the case left a psychological void that could not be easily filled. The family of the mother and 2 daughters from the third home filed a lawsuit against the Saitama police, arguing that authorities failed to warn residents in time, even though they knew a potentially dangerous suspect was on the loose. They argued that if residents had been notified earlier about the unstable man in the area, at least part of the tragedy might have been prevented. However, courts at all levels dismissed the claim, stating that police had no legal obligation to issue a warning before determining the suspect's actual level of danger. Even with the courts siding with law enforcement, public debate continued throughout Japan. Many experts argued that the Kumagaya case exposed a long-standing gap in the support system for immigrant workers. Foreign laborers were brought into factories to address workforce shortages, but they had almost no access to language assistance, mental health care, or community integration. People like Byron, isolated, unable to speak Japanese, and without anyone to turn to when their mental state deteriorated, were left vulnerable for years without notice. The case also pushed Saitama Prefecture and other regions to reevaluate how criminal alerts were shared within communities. After 2015, many areas began implementing emergency notification systems using broadcasts, text messages, or community alerts whenever a dangerous suspect was on the run, aiming to prevent residents from being caught off guard. Still, the biggest question the case left behind remains unresolved. In a society increasingly dependent on immigrant labor, Is Japan truly prepared to integrate these workers into its social framework, not just into its factory lines? Extreme cases like Kumagaya are rare, but they show how a single individual slipping through the cracks of the community safety net can lead to consequences far beyond what anyone expects.
The series of killings in Kumagaya ended with a life sentence, but the questions it raised remain unanswered. For years, Japan has relied on immigrant labor to sustain industries that local workers no longer want to take on. Yet the support systems for those living on the margins of society, people who cannot speak Japanese, who have no social network, and who have no idea where to seek help in moments of crisis, have not kept pace with reality. Byron's case shows that when someone lives in isolation for too long, without the tools to communicate and without access to timely medical assistance, instability can grow quietly until it spirals out of control. Not every immigrant faces the same struggles he did, and certainly not everyone reaches such an extreme. But this case is a warning about a gap in the system. When even one person slips through the safety net, the impact can spread far beyond what anyone expects. The Kumagaya case is not just a sequence of criminal events. It reflects what can happen when a person gradually loses connection with the world around them. And in a society that is becoming increasingly diverse, one question still remains. How do we ensure that no one is left alone in a place that seems crowded, yet can make a person feel profoundly isolated?